Welcome to the Hard Talk HR webinar with Tamra Chandler. My name is Ben Churchhouse, and I will be your host for today, helping to introduce the topic and the speakers to you. So today's webinar is the Hard Talk HR, How Performance Management is Killing Performance and What to Do About It. So I will be leading you through the introduction to today's webinar. So I just firstly want to talk about sort of the overall goals and the idea behind obviously this webinar series. So the first thing that we're looking to do is connect ideas with impact about new business realities, how HR professionals add value with how HR can improve the work that gets done in organizations. So that's the main focus of the webinar today. So I hope everyone who's signing in from all over the world, we have over 850 registered attendees for the webinar, can obviously get something out of it that they can take back to the office with them. So this is really the main focus of the webinar, and we want to keep it as interactive as possible to really connect you and Tamra to answer your questions and thoughts about performance management. So how we're going to interact today, if you are logged into Webinar Jam, you can see on the right-hand side a comment box if you see on your screen at the moment. Please type your comments down the bottom. Now, please be aware that we cannot answer every comment or every question that you pose. So what's going to happen is that my marketing team will select 3 or 4 questions for Tamra to answer at the conclusion of her presentation, and she will address them in turn. Now, don't be worried if your comment or question isn't answered. We will take note of all of them, and we will send them in an individual file to Tamra at the conclusion of the webinar, and she will address you in kind. So don't worry, there's plenty of time to answer as many questions as we can. So if you have a question, please feel free to write it down, and don't be discouraged if it's not read out at the conclusion. Furthermore, if you would like to share and tweet with us on social media, you can use the hashtag HRCongress17. Likewise, you can also follow the HR Congress on LinkedIn and Twitter, as you can see there below. Just quickly, obviously, my name is Ben Churchhouse, and you may be aware that my managing director and the CEO and founder of the HR Congress, Mihai Nodge, was supposed to be leading the webinar today. Unfortunately, he can't make it, so I'd just like to fill in as the producer of the HR Congress to give you a little bit of an introduction to the event very quickly. It's going to be on the 28th and 29th of November in the Egg, Brussels, featuring over 50 world-class thought-leading presenters in HR, including Dave Ulrich, Herminia Ibarra, Gareth Jones, Sydney Finkelstein, and more. For more information on that, please go to the website brussels.hrcongress.com. And as a special treat for all of you webinar attendees, there's a 20% discount for all of your attendees. So please enter the code Tamra_webinar at the registration, and you can have a 20% discount to the Congress. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce your speaker for this webinar today, Tamra Chandler. Mrs. Chandler has spent the majority of her career thinking about how people impact work on the way they're motivated, developing new and effective ways for organizations to achieve the ultimate win-win, inspiring people-driven performance. She's also the CEO and founder of People Firm, one of Washington State's fastest growing businesses and most successful woman-owned firms. She's an award-winning leader in her field, and she's been recognized by Consulting Magazine twice as one of the top consultants in the United States. Tamra has a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering from Montana State University and an MBA from the University of Washington. She's also the author of the book, How Performance Management is Killing Performance and What to Do About It. So without standing on too much more ceremony, I'd like to hand you over to the capable hands of Tamra Chandler, and I hope that everyone gains something valuable out.
Morning or hello. Thank you for...
So, yes, Tamra.
Yes, can you hear me, Ben? Am I good?
Yes, we can. We can. We're good.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I hope you all take advantage of that discount code and go to the HR Congress. I was there last November, and there was just so much information. It was literally one of the best conferences I've ever attended, with the quality of the speakers and the quality of the content. So I highly encourage you to join Ben and the team. So we're going to talk today about how performance management is killing performance and what to do about it. Talk about this, author, founder, human, that's sort of my background. let me give you a little bit more about how I got into this topic. I started thinking about performance management many, many years ago when I was the chief people officer at Hitachi Consulting. And at that time, I built a very robust and in many ways very nice performance solution, but it really was weighted down by a lot of the traditional things that we've all built into traditional performance management processes. And this was back in the early 2000s. And so if I fast forward later after I'd launched People Firm, I kind of had that experience in my past. And, we do a lot of work with people around talent and driving inspirational performance. And I was sitting at my desk and I got a call from our friend James Shalaber, who at that time was the CHRO at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And James called me up and he said, "Hey, Tamra, I have a task for you. I want you to write us a white paper. And that white paper, we want it to be about performance management because we're getting ready to redesign it. And oh, by the way, all of our leaders are scientists, so it needs to be data rich. And can you please answer this question for us? How is performance management driving performance?" So when James called, given my past experience at Hitachi, it seemed like such an opportune time to really take a fresh look at this. Because while I knew there were some things that were working, there were still things that weren't working. And this was still back in like 2011, 2012. At that time, as I started to really dig into what others were thinking and saying about performance management, you were finding that there were sort of whispers around that, hey, this process isn't working. And that was mostly amongst thought leaders and those who were willing to sort of take a stand. Over the time, what we've really seen is that more and more people have weighed into this conversation. And I'd say it's really gone from a whisper to a roar as far as the traditional models aren't working. And we really need to look at a different way to engage our people and drive organizational and individual performance. So I want to stop, though, and take a couple of quick polls, because what we've also learned is despite all the conversation, a lot of people still haven't done anything yet. So first, I want to kind of find out how all of you think about your own performance management process. And then I'm going to ask you a question, if you haven't rebooted it, about what's holding you back. So I'll turn it over to Christina to launch our first poll.
Poll.
Looks like we've got a lot of answers coming in. Lots of 3s and 2s, I see. All right. Okay. I think I'm maybe not seeing everybody else is seeing.
Hi, Tamra. If you just go to the webinar polls on the topic with top corner of the right-hand side.
Sorry, Ben. Yep. That's my bad. All right. Thanks, everybody. So it looks like we've got 54% of people that are need a reboot. 41% say few issues, but generally okay. And 4% love it. Well, that's better statistics than we see in some places. I'll share some more data with you in a minute. So let's go to the next poll. This one is if you haven't rebooted. So if you're in that 55%, or maybe some of those in the 40%, what's holding you back from moving forward? All right. So it looks like we've got about 50% saying unclear how to determine rewards without a rating. That's pretty common. Only 5% saying their bosses will never buy it. You guys have more forward-thinking bosses than what we see a lot of people saying. And let's see, the other big number is other. Okay. So if we look at other data, I've been collecting this data from a number of audiences around the world, and we just continue to add to it. And in fact, you can have others take the survey. The link to the survey on our website is up there on the screen, and we'll be sharing these slides with you, so you don't need to worry about taking notes on that. So you can ask others if they want to take the poll later. Here's generally what we're seeing. About 71% of organizations are still saying they need a reboot. 23% generally are saying it's okay, and still 4%, which I think was the same number we had, are saying they love it. So despite all the noise and all the conversation, we're still seeing a lot of people holding back on taking any radical or significant changes to the performance management process. When we ask this larger pool, and I've got over several thousand people in here, we see again, like you, about 45, you guys had 50% aren't sure how to move forward with ratings, with rewards without ratings. That seems to be the big stumbling block for most people. Number two tends to typically be this lack of trust for managers, just unsure of how to really hand more of the reins to the managers in this process. And then, as I said, we see more other organizations, more than you guys came through, saying that they're having a trouble getting their leaders to move forward. So here, let's dig into this a little bit more, and hopefully what I can give you is some things for those people, the 54% who really are saying we're ready for a reboot. Maybe I can give you a little inspiration or some ideas for how to start moving forward. What I want to cover is a little bit about what we know about traditional performance management. I'm going to talk about how we can start to shift our thinking around driving performance, and I'm going to touch lightly on the redesign and reboot process. Just so you know, in the book, I go through detail around literally how to facilitate meetings and walk people through this process, but I'll just touch on that lightly today. So if we start with what we know about traditional performance management, here's what we know for sure, is this process is truly universally hated. We think of it predominantly as a necessary evil. It's not just that our employees dislike it, managers dislike it, and most leaders dislike it. The interesting thing is, I did a presentation a little over, I guess it was almost a year and a half ago, and I had an audience of about 1,400 people, and I asked that 1,400 people, please stand up if you love your performance management process. And in that room of 1,400, and I was very encouraging, I had only 2 people stand up. So again, that 4% tends to kind of hold true. So we see that we really do not have a big love for that. The fact that only 2 people stood up in that meeting was later. One of the gentlemen who stood came up. I stood up because we don't have a performance management process. So that was why he loved it. They didn't have one. The interesting thing is when you start to really look at what we are talking about here is it's very meaningful stuff. I mean, the reason we've stuck with it and tried to work through this process for so long is because the 3 goals of performance management are really important goals. First, we want to be developing our people. Secondly, we want to be rewarding equitably. And third, we want to be driving organizational performance. So how do we help our people grow and thrive? How do we ensure that we're really providing rewards in an equitable, not equal, but an equitable kind of way? And how do we align the team and ensure that we are all rowing the boat in the same direction? Now, I don't care what organization you are. I believe these are the 3 common goals of performance management, and I haven't had anyone really argue with me too much on that. Interestingly enough, when I first started doing this work, I realized no one had really crisply articulated what is it we're trying to do. We all kind of knew it, but we spent a lot of time thinking about, let's get really crisp about what we're trying to do and understand how these 3 common goals can influence how we want to design and think about performance management. So these are very foundational to our approach. Now, when you think about those 3 common goals, the challenge is we don't have, we're not doing very well against those goals. In fact, what we're finding is most of the research and most of the data continues to be more and more damning. You see here, like 1 in 4 executives believe their current performance management reflects true employee performance. 13% of managers and 6% of CEOs thought their year-end reviews were effective, etc. Given I've been watching this data for a lot of years, what's interestingly is it just keeps getting worse and worse around sort of the trust and the confidence in traditional performance management. So if it's not working, and I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about why it's not working, I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. But I think before we start thinking about what we want to do instead, we need to make sure that we understand the fatal flaws of performance management so we don't fall back into them as we go forward. So let me share with you quickly what we call the 8 fatal flaws. Fatal flaw number 1 is this idea that a theory without evidence is just a bad theory. And this ties back to that question that James asked me when he called me that day and said, will you write us a white paper? How does performance management drive performance? As we were working on that white paper back in that day, we were really struggling to answer that question. And we would float drafts of the white paper over to James and he would say, you still haven't answered it. And we finally came back and said, here's the thing. What we all know is that engagement drives performance. It's causal, it's proven. We have buckets of data that support that. But what we cannot prove is that performance management drives engagement. In fact, more often than not, when we dive into it, what we're learning is performance management, when executed in the traditional ways that we've managed it, may be driving more disengagement than it's driving engagement. So we've spent a ton of time, energy, effort in a process with all the best intentions, but we may be actually driving the opposite outcomes of what we want. So fatal flaw number 2 talks about nobody opens up to the person who pokes them in the eye. This gets to the idea that we have connected this relationship between the manager and the employee, and we pack it all into this annual or biannual conversation between the two of them. And it just doesn't set us up for great conversations, because what we're doing is in that conversation, the employee knows that I've got to go in there ready to make my best case. I've got to show all the great things I did. I have to really kind of sell myself, because I know that the outcome of this meeting can be promotion and pay and all sorts of opportunities that are important to me and my future. The manager is often coming to this conversation trying to manage expectations. They maybe have limitations in what they can do. They may be operating within a bell curve. There's things that they're trying to manage as well. So when we pack all of this into these 1 or 2 conversations in a year, we have completely eroded the opportunity to have really honest and open dialogue. And typically we've lost the whole focus on development, and we've ended up with more of a negotiation that's happening once or twice a year about how are we going to assess the performance of that individual. Fatal flaw number 3 is this problem that nobody remembers the good work. We as humans are just a little bit prone to the negative, and we tend to remember the things that didn't go well or that caused us some kind of difficulty. And so typically when we come into those conversations as a manager, we may tend to overemphasize those things and completely forget all the great stuff that happened. And then of course you have other elements of recency bias and things that really impact kind of what the conversation is when we try to pack it into those sort of once or twice a year review cycles. You know, in the English language, and I'm sure this is probably true in many of our languages, we find that 65% of our descriptive words are negative. We tend to just pull those forward. And what's interesting is even strong performers that might be rated top of your system, will often leave their performance process feeling let down, because what they hear was the negative thing. They even if you said the 4 things they did great, what they took away was, this is the thing you should have done better. And so that's again where we can start to see that disengagement happening, even for someone who may have come out of the process highly rated. Fatal flaw number 4, no man or woman is an island. This gets into the issue that we are trying to isolate the performance or the assessment of one person in this fact that they are part of a system of much greater proportions, and that they can't necessarily control all those elements within the system that they're working or operating. And this, if we look at research, we can show that you can take a high-performing individual out of one situation and drop them into another situation, and they will no longer be high-performing. And I know that I've certainly lived in those situations, and I'm sure many of you have as well, where you're working in an environment that you are thriving, or you are working in an environment that you just can't. your wind. You just can't really work at your optimal pace. And that's a lot more to do about the system than it is necessarily about the skills or capabilities of that individual within the system. Fatal flaw number 5 is our favorite. We are not machines. This gets into the idea that fairness and standardization in ratings is simply unachievable. We can't do it. We try to convince ourselves that we can create a numeric model that we can use and have confidence in. But the reality is this is a human process. We need to put humans back in the middle of it. And in order to do that, we need to move away from this idea of being able to rate or assess. Here's part of there's several problems with ratings. Number 1 is this factor called the idiosyncratic effect. And that says if I was to rate Ben on this call and said, hey, Ben, I think you're a 3.5. Don't even get me started with decimal points. But if I was to rate Ben, the problem with that is my rating of Ben is pretty much about 65% about me. It's my scale. It's what I think looks good. It's the way I like Ben to work. It has way more to do about me than it has to do with Ben. In fact, once you kind of peel back rounding error, errors and all those other things, it's probably about 20 or 25% about Ben. Secondly, we're trying to rate people on a scale that is consistent when those individuals are probably performing jobs that are wildly different. So we're trying to say we're going to take all of our employees who are doing all these different tasks within different environments and try to put them on the same scale. That's also unachievable. And then finally, frankly, as humans, we can recognize really strong performance and we can recognize poor performance. We have a very hard time differentiating between the middle. Think about that middle of the bell curve. If you have a calibration meeting, my bet is you spend a lot of time arguing over the 3s and the 4s. That's because we really cannot separate that performance at that level. All right, so fatal flaw number 6, we are not machines redo. This speaks to the fact that the output of those decisions we're making is not reliable, yet we're pumping them into sort of our talent management machines and making all sorts of other decisions out of them. Promotion, compensation, project assignments, a lot of things are happening based on a rating scale that we really can't rely on. So we kind of have that garbage in, garbage out problem with performance management. I haven't talked to an organization in years that isn't trying to drive collaboration and innovation and create environments where the people can thrive, yet many of us are still using a performance management process that creates competition, that's eroding the exact thing that we're looking to drive. So we really need to also think about, if we want a collaborative environment, how do we use performance management to help drive that rather than impede it? And then finally, I poke a little bit here at pay for performance with fatal flaw number 8. We are not Pavlov's dog. We've spent a lot of time creating systems that put way too much emphasis on extrinsic rewards. The truth is, as humans, once we have our basic needs met and we feel that we are fairly paid, we are not motivated to go the extra mile based on extrinsic rewards. We are motivated based on intrinsic rewards. The team we're working on, the work that we're doing, the purpose and the mission of the work and the importance to it, and being part of something bigger than we are. That's what drives us once we have that base need met. So pay is tricky because if people do not perceive it as fair, then it drives disengagement, but it is not the driver unless it's a very crisp type of, sales organization, for example, where if you do X, you get Y. If it isn't super hard-coded, it does not drive additional behavior. I play with the idea of pay for performance because in theory, the theories behind pay for performance are fine. The problem is that we typically aren't really creating differentiated recognition with our pay for performance models. So we really need to sort of look back and question, if we say we're a pay for performance organization, are we really recognizing true contribution, and is there differentiation in the way that we're recognizing the people within our organization? So those are the 8 fatal flaws. I've whipped through them pretty quickly. And I love to end with this quote from Dr. Edwards Deming, because the man was brilliant and so far ahead of us. He wrote this in 1982. And I'll just read it quickly because it's just so powerful. The performance appraisal nourishes short-term performance, annihilates long-term planning. It builds fear, demolishes teamwork, nourishes rivalry and politics. It leaves people bitter, crushed, bruised, battered, desolate, despondent, dejected, feeling inferior, some even depressed, unfit for work, for weeks after receipt of a rating, unable to comprehend why they are inferior. It is unfair. It ascribes to people in a group differences that may be caused totally by the system they work in. That's a mouthful. But I found this after I had been doing a lot of my work, and we'd already defined the 8 flaws and the 8 shifts. But in one paragraph, Dr. Demings really calls out all 8 of the fundamental flaws of our traditional performance management processes. So with that, I would love to move to another poll and ask each of you to pick which of these fatal flaws, as you think of rebooting or even maybe tuning the process that you have today, which of these would you most like to leave behind, eradicate performance management programs? Okay, it looks like look, we've got most of the numbers in. So no man or women is an island is coming out as the top choice, which is that's great. It's not often the one that gets chosen, but I think it's such an important one, recognizing that we really have to consider the system, and that ties also with the competition and the collaboration, which we're seeing about 11% support that. Yeah, so we see really kind of interesting spread across all of these, and that's pretty common. What I would recommend you do if you are thinking about rebooting or your performance management process is you can actually use this to drive a dialogue within your own organization, to engage your leaders, for example, in a conversation. That's how we use it a lot, is to really help kind of start thinking about what are those elements that we want to move away from. All right, so let's move to the other side of things. We're talking about how we can rethink, how we shift our thinking, how we move to something better that is going to create those experiences that we want our team and our organizations to have. So we call those, not surprisingly, the 8 fundamental shifts, 8 flaws, 8 shifts. So here we go. Fundamental shift number 1 is this idea of open the door, that we need to shift from this need to know to a very open and transparent environment. If you look at the research regarding what is particularly holding employees back, but even leaders, is we don't trust the system. We don't understand it. We don't know how do we control it. It seems opaque to us. And when we don't have that trust, it really diminishes the value of what we can get out of any kind of program that we put in place. So it's very important that we start to open up and be as transparent as we can with how the process works, how people can engage in it, and multiple things. So as we've been working with organizations, what we're finding is there's a number of ways that you can think about how you create this culture of transparency. What are some ideas of how you drive this? So for example, you might move from an individual goals being set between the manager and the employee to something that is more collaborative, that's more open, that where the organization that you're working in has more transparency and visibility to what the individual and team goals are across the organization. Another idea is, rather than having sort of these backroom conversations about new projects or new roles or those opportunities, how do you create more visibility to what the career options are, the open positions within an organization, that allows people to have more of a voice in areas they might be interested in, and can create a lot more talent mobility and velocity in how you move talent through your organization by being a lot more transparent in what those opportunities are. And lastly, one of my favorites is, can we start to get more transparent with salary, bonus, and profit sharing, where in many organizations we still have very limited transparency. Now, things like Glassdoor and all that are starting to change just what information is available. But I think as HR leaders and organizational leaders, we can start to think about how do we take control of that and share that information with our employees in a way that empowers them, and also kind of put some checks and balances in maybe your rewards program. So that was fundamental shift number 1. So if we talk about fundamental shift number 2, it's this idea of give the steering wheel to your employees. Let's move this out of the hands of the managers and into the hands of our employees. So it's an employee-powered process. Here's an idea. It's their career. It's their, they own it, and they need to be the ones who are really driving the pace of their development, the conversations that they want to be having with their manager, with their peers, with others to drive their performance. The more that we can put it in the hands of our employees, the more power there is to it. And one of the things that we know, if you look at engagement data, one of the top drivers of engagement is having a voice, having a say in my career. And I honestly think we get such better results when we hand the steering wheel over to our employees. So what that might mean is, rather than spending all of our time as HR leaders, putting a process in place that requires controls and oversights and checks and balances and forms to be completed, if we put all that energy into creating content that we can put in the hands of our employees so they can really understand, how do I grow, what opportunities are here to me, what are the needs of the organization, and how can I match the needs of the organization with my passion and my capability. And if there's capability I need to grow to do the work that I'm passionate about, how do I do that? And so the more that we can provide that information and tools and content to the employees and put it in their hands, the more we can have a powerful system that's driven with employee power. Fundamental shift number 3 is, let's change our focus. Let's move away from this idea of past performance, and let's turn our energy to future capability. I would say we spend probably 80% of the time in traditional performance management programs looking back, talking about what happened, and maybe 20% looking forward. I encourage you to flip it around. What if we spent a little bit of time looking back and understanding what have we learned from the past, and particularly taking a strength-based approach to that? What are the superpowers our employees bring to the table, and how can we do more with those superpowers? How can we connect them to the vision of the organization so they are able to bring their skill, their mastery, their capability, and bring the most value to the organization? It's such an interesting shift in how it empowers the conversation and really changes the tone of a performance management program. Oops. Sorry, got ahead of myself. So, and what we're seeing and working with a lot of organizations is really moving from this idea that performance feedback is the heavy focus. It's all about, I'm going to tell you what you did right and what you did wrong, to much more of a growth coaching, creating a growth mindset kind of culture that is really balancing both that element of what have we learned and how do we take what we've learned and really focus on growth. I've even debated this picture if I should actually put growth down at the bottom and tilt it much more that way, but we really want to shift to this growth mindset kind of culture when we focus on the future. Fundamental shift number 4 is my absolute favorite of the fundamental shifts. And it's the idea of moving away from this one-size-fits-all to an approach that is customized and nuanced. And the interesting thing about this fundamental shift is it really has multiple levels of meaning. At the top level, I want to argue about why we need to create more unique approaches to performance and management, company to company, organization to organization. So when I started out early on, I said, hey, these are the 3 common goals. And those are true. Those are the 3 common goals for every single organization. That's my belief. However, that doesn't mean that those goals have the same weighting or priority or organization as they to you. We really need to step back and understand where we are in our maturity, the nature of our people, the talent market we're competing in, the culture that we're operating in. We need to step back and look at those things and think about, across those three common goals, how do we balance them? How do we create a program that is specific to us, not cookie cutter, but tuned to us? Because that's one of the interesting things about traditional performance management. When I go in and talk to Oregon, the first 10 or 15 minutes telling me what's unique about them. But then when I ask performance, what I find is about 95% of organizations are doing it exactly the same. Well, that's crazy making. So we really need to step back and think about, how do we create a customized solution for our organization that matches where we are and where we want to go? That's level one. Level two is being able to say, hey, even within our organizations, and I saw as many of you were signing in, you come from global, complex organizations with, I imagine, a lot of diversity in your workforce. We need to start to think about that diversity in our workforce, and how do we bring customized approaches to the different workforce segments that we have. It's crazy that we should be operating the same performance management approach for our scientists in California as we might for a manufacturing team in Germany or China or wherever. I think we need to really kind of think about, how do we create tools and solutions that can be customized to that individual, to the nature of their work, to those specific workforce segments. And so that's really what we're seeing a lot more, is sort of moving away from this one size process and tool set to really a portfolio of tools that thinks about the different workforce segments that we have and allows them to tune the process in a way that is far more meaningful and drives much more value for each of those different workforce segments. Fundamental shift number 5 is this idea of welcoming more voices. So a lot of you chose the fatal flaw to move away from, of that, the person who pokes me in the eye, that conversation between just the manager and the employee. We also talked about moving away from fatal flaw number 5, about the ratings. So the question is, if this is a human process and we recognize that we're not going to get the humanness out of it, how do we use elements that are just mitigate the inherent biases that come with who we are? And the best way that we can do that is welcome more voices to the conversation. So at the end of this, if I ask just 2 of you to give me feedback, that would only give me one kind of view. If I ask all of you to give me some ideas for how to improve this in the future, I would get a much richer perspective, and I'd be able to really zero in on the things that were most meaningful. So I think it's important that we think about, how do we start to create that dialogue within our organizations? How do we build the muscle that helps each of us coach each other as we go through our daily work? And so we really are working with a lot of organizations are trying to build what we call this coaching culture, that are moving away from this sort of hard-coded relationship between the manager and the employee, and really thinking about it more as an ecosystem. Who are the people that can help me grow? How do I do that? What are the conversations I want to be having throughout the year that help me plan my career, that help me understand what I'm doing well, that help me fine-tune the things that I can be doing better? And that's the nature of what we want to be moving to in a more modern and impactful performance solution. Fundamental shift number 6 is this idea of stop policing and start empowering. We really need to move away from this idea that performance management is a control mechanism, that it's a legal safeguard of any of those types of nature. If you've got an employee who is challenged, we need to deal with that in the moment. We should not be designing our performance management solutions to solve for those employee issues. And in fact, I've spoken in the US at legal conferences, because lawyers actually don't like performance management either, because oftentimes in the traditional model, the documentation becomes more of a liability in a situation for the company than it is an asset. So you're really much better off, and I know it varies, country to country with our labor laws, but I think we really need to think about how we capture any employee issues in the moment and in a very crisp and concise way, so we're able to provide that feedback and insight, but we also have a record of what's happening, and we aren't burdening the performance management process with being that record. Fundamental shift number 7 in scent collaboration is not a surprising shift. It's the other side of the fatal flaw number 7. If we want to build cultures of innovation, and that we really need to be incenting collaboration. And that means frequently moving away from these individual metrics to more shared metrics and commitment. And I would also say it really takes you thinking about, what does team mean within your organization? It may not be the teams that you think of when you think about your org chart. It may be more about the teams that come together to deliver value for your organization. So for example, we worked with a large healthcare hospital system recently, and we redefined what team meant as far as creating shared commitments in that organization that spoke to everyone who would work on a floor. So for example, on the oncology floor, it wasn't just the doctors and the nurses, but it was also the people who delivered the meals and who cleaned the rooms, and anyone who is coming from that organization to support those patients on the oncology floor were part of that team. And so we could start to create shared goals for that team that really kind of shifted the way we think about collaboration and how we talk about the work that we do and the impact that we have for our customers or those that we serve. Fundamental shift number 8 is also the flip of we are not Pavlov's dog. It's this idea of let's get real with rewards. Now, many of you said the big issue you have in moving forward is the rewards piece. And trust me, we spend a lot of time when we're doing the design work helping organizations think through this. What's interestingly I've found is oftentimes the employees are more real about rewards than we are from HR and management perspective. We're still trying to manipulate something that our employees are seeing through. So what I would encourage you to do is move to this idea of pay for capabilities and reward for contribution. So I'll say that again, pay for capabilities and reward for contribution. And what I'm proposing here is that we pull apart the idea of capability pay, being paid for the skills, the knowledge, the experiences, the capabilities that you have that you need to do your job, and separating that from what does real contribution work look like? What does contribution look like above and beyond the core expectations of the role that your employees have? And the more that you can start to get clear with that, and we're seeing a lot of organizations even changing sort of the rhythm of these two things, changing how they would address any base pay compensation from the time that they look at reward and contribute and other types of contributions. And so we really encourage organizations to think about building a culture of recognition, not just thinking about, the actual, just the money, the merit side of it, but trying to move towards more of a culture of recognition and thinking about total rewards as a portfolio, and how are you going to use that portfolio to recognize and reward the individuals within your organization. And so you may have different cadence with how this works. There may be different ways in which you're thinking about and designing your reward system. And there may even be some more, crowdsourcing kinds of elements in it, whether that's peer-based rewards programs or other ways in which you're really calling out those people who have driven the most significant contributions in your companies that you want to recognize. So that is the 8 fundamental shifts. And so we'll move to another poll. And this is the same as before, but which of these is your favorite? When you think about designing something new or maybe enhancing the programs that you have, which of these fundamental shifts would you like to include in your future solution? I feel like we need some game show music behind the polls, maybe like the Jeopardy.
Maybe for next time, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it looks like still a few votes coming in. Looks like most of the votes are in. Okay, so again, we see a pretty even distribution across the big winners being change our focus, so really start moving towards future strength-based kind of thinking. And interestingly, the stop policing, start empowering. So how do we really sort of shift this away from a control and oversight and much more to an empowered, and I would include in there probably employee-driven process. All right, thank you. So we've talked now about what we know about traditional performance management and the 8 flaws. We've talked about shifting our thinking and driving performance around the 8 fundamental shifts. I hope I gave you a few ideas of sort of the types of solutions, you know, and some of those examples that people are bringing forward. So let's just talk briefly about redesigning and rebooting performance management. So what I want to stress is if you're going to go down this path, please stay true to a few core ideas. And they're not complex ideas, but I think they're really, really important. Number one is this idea of avoid the knotted solution. And when you saw the picture of the book earlier, you saw this big knot on the front of the book. And, you know, that's one of the challenges is we have tried to solve those 3 common goals with sort of one annualized process. And we've tried to pack all of those things that we're trying to do into that one process. And that's a big part of what's gotten us in trouble. So what I think we need to do, and we're starting to think about this, is start to pull it apart. So if we think about the 3 common goals, how can we solve for each of those, maybe with different pieces rather than with one big ubiquitous process? Clearly, you're not surprised that I'll tell you one of the other things to really think about are the 3 goals. When you want to build your solution, get your heads around how important are these goals to us, relative, what's the relative importance one to the other, and how connected are they? Because sometimes you want them tightly connected and sometimes you don't. So we think of this as an analogy. One of the first reboots we did many years ago was for a sports company. We came up with this idea and we've sort of run with it because it helps us think about those 3 common goals. Think about them like the frame of a bicycle, and your organization is the rider. And you need to be thinking about what kind of bicycle that you want to ride. How important are those 3 goals relative to each other? And how does that influence the frame of the bike that you're riding? It's important that you really kind of select the right frame for you, and then you design a solution that supports that. Are you shifting, for example, your business model? Is this a time where you need to stress very strongly how to drive the organizational alignment to the new goals of the organization? Or are you competing in a talent market that's brutal and you need to put a ton of your focus on developing people because that is really what attracts people to your organization? Or are you fighting hard in a compensation space and you need to put more on rewards to retain and bring more people in? So there's different ideas that might influence kind of the shape of the frame. Now, we're a consultant, so I joke we have to have a 5-step process, but our language is a little bit different and for good reason. So we talk about mobilize, sketch, configure, build, and implement. So sure, build and implement, that makes sense. But when we talk about sketch, here we're talking about getting really clear on what are those importance of those 3 common goals, and underneath that, what are the core design principles that you will design your solution to. And then we use this idea of configure because, again, if we're abandoning the knotted solution, that means that we need to be picking different solutions that we're going to bring together, and together those will create the experience that we want for our people. So that's why our language is a little bit different. A couple of thoughts on this. As you're getting into mobilize, you've got to lead the leaders. You've got to bring your leaders with you. Now, this group had less concern about leadership, but I've seen many organizations that haven't spent enough time educating and bringing their leaders along, that they got too far down the design path and then suddenly found that they were shut down because they didn't have strong leadership support and where they were going and why it was important and how it tied to the strategy of the organization. I also encourage you to really invite the right people into the conversation. So what are the diverse voices that you need to have represented? And particularly if you have complex workforce segments, how do you ensure that those workforce segments, or if you've a multicultural organization, how do you ensure that those cultures are represented? And there's different ways you can do that, either through what we call the design team or the conversation group, and including kind of people at different points of view in your process to help them be part of the conversation. In Sketch, I talked about really aligning to your design principles and making sure that you have clarity around what are the key outcomes you are seeking for your solution. And once you get those, that's a great way to invite more people to the conversation, because you can be sharing and validating those design principles with a very broad group, even with the whole company. You can also then, all the way through the design work, always be testing back to those design principles. Are you achieving them? Are you staying true to what you wanted to do? And this is very important because it's easy to fall back, and we really want you to sort of stay true to the design principles. It's easy to fall back to those old habits and old ways. Now, we have a tool that helps you play with this. It's free. The link is there. And again, we'll send the slides out. But we call this our sketchbook. You can go out. It asks you 12 questions about your current state. It asks you to pick 6 of 19, what I call canned design principles. Once you pick your 6 and you click on that Generate Your Frame button, it's going to show you how your frame leans. Are you leaning towards any one of those 3 common goals, or are you balanced across the 3 of them? We can also use the sketchbook to do this in a crowdsourced way. This is a great way to drive a conversation within your organization, to find out how different people are thinking about this and what some of the most popular design principles are for your organization, and how you can take those and start to create something that's customized to your language and to your team. In configuration, the only thing I'll share here is you've really got to think about this holistically. So we have 6 what we call configuration categories that you need to be designing to. You see that 6th one there is total rewards. Don't try to leave that out. If that's what's holding you back, it's got to be part of the conversation. You really have to be thinking about this as a holistic solution across everything from goals and alignment, performance insights, mentoring, career development, talent, and total rewards. All right, so here's my final thoughts, and then we'll open it up for questions. Number 1 is there is no one right answer. The fact that we all have been doing this the same is a wrong answer. The fact that we've done a lot of those fatal flaws, there's some bad ideas in there. We just really need to make sure we stay away from those bad ideas. The best design for you is probably not the best design for the organization next door to you. You really need to make sure it reflects who you are and where you're going as an organization. And lastly, we find that the new solutions that we're designing with our clients are often more simple, but getting there is rarely simple because it requires a change in our behavior. It requires a change in the way our leaders lead. It requires a change in how our employees show up and take ownership of their careers. So you really have to spend a lot of time thinking about the change management side of that and how you bring people with you through this process. So that's what I've got. I think, Ben, I'll turn it back to you for opening it up for questions.
Yes, indeed. Presentation. It was fascinating to see the step-by-step process and how you evaluate performance management, the problems, and obviously set up some of the potential solutions. So I hope everyone out there has gained some valuable insights. So I've got a couple of questions here from the audience. So the first question is from Karina. And Karina asked, what do you mean by making the reward elements more transparent, the way they are calculated or the exact amount? So obviously talking about rewards. Yeah.
That's a great question. And there's actually a whole spectrum that you can choose, which you kind of laid out there, Christina, from just helping people understand more of how those numbers are influenced to being much more transparent in what the numbers are. What I have seen in organizations where maybe you aren't saying number to number by employee, because that can actually cause some other problems. If you can clean up your job architecture and your role framework, and I say that because a lot of organizations have gotten kind of out of control, but if that can be kind of cleaned up, we can start to share, for example, a scatter plot of pay by maybe job category or, particular roles. I've done this at People Firm, and we're not even that big, but we tend to show for each of our core roles sort of the scatter of where people, a scatter dots of where people are in a band. And what I've found is it shuts down a lot of the noise of the misperceptions people have about pay. But I'll also tell you, it's actually surfaced a couple of places where we needed to adjust, where my team came back to me and said, I had two people when we first did this come back to me and say, hey, I don't think I'm paid fairly based on my peers. And as we looked at it, they were correct. And what they were both situations where they had progressed so rapidly, we frankly, as leaders, hadn't had the courage to move them to the compensation that they really were performing at. And so it was that transparency sort of held us accountable, and it took out a lot of the noise. So there is a lot of debate out there on the transparency around rewards. I think, again, you have to figure out what works for your culture, what works in your environment, what works in your country, and pick a process that is as transparent as you can be.
All right, so it's a fairly comprehensive answer. So I have another question here from Kamlesh Patel, and Kamlesh asked, how do we educate millennials, the young professionals, on the performance management system, improving performance management?
Well, the interesting thing is I think that a lot of the modern solutions are very comfortable for millennials because they're our first digital natives. We can put a lot of tools in place. They're used to a lot more transparency and openness and being rated and feedback from their peers. They've sort of grown up with that. So I think a lot of the things that we're looking for, they're probably more comfortable than some of the generations that grew up with a traditional model. And they are very hungry to own their career. So I think the key thing that we need to do is give them more information, because oftentimes they overestimate, and this is just more about young people, they overestimate their capabilities or their experiences, or they don't understand sort of the work that they have to do to grow and advance within the organization. So I think the more that we spend time helping provide more visibility and transparency to career pathing, what that looks like in the organization, how they gain experiences, how they have a voice in the opportunities and the roles, I think that's what's going to get your millennials going.
Okay, wonderful. I have another question here from Kara, and she wants to know, we've got a couple of minutes left just to make sure everyone's on track. She wants to know how to educate leaders on the steps that they need to take to prepare their organizations for performance reboot or performance management. So how do you, in a sense, get the message across? How do you put the groundwork in before you sort of go and actually start implementing these steps?
Yeah, well, we could have a whole nother webinar, Ben, on just that question. But what I would say is a couple of things. Number one, make sure, as I said earlier, you bring them through the process with you. So they are with you every step in the way. They understand why you're changing it. They understand the value and where you're going and how it drives the organizational outcomes and strategies that they want. And so you need to make sure that they're with you in that sense, that they understand why the old models aren't working. But once you've got that, then you really have to build their capability in being able to operate successfully in a new situation. So I think it depends on what your design looks like, but really once you get there, looking at the design and thinking about how do we help leaders be successful in this model? And we find oftentimes it's a mixture of providing them tools and providing them training. It doesn't have to be heavy training, but providing them opportunities to role play and work in that. So they start to build those skill sets around being inquisitive and coaching and strengths, looking at strengths and those types of things. So we sort of break it down in those little bits and think about what are the capabilities they need and how do we help them build the muscle to do that. Right.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's more or less our time here, and I apologize if anyone has any further questions. As I mentioned before, we will take note of all these questions and send them through to Tamra to answer individually. So thank you again, Tamra, for this wonderful webinar. And I'd just like to sign off again by quickly thanking Tamra for her attendance today, and to mention to everyone that there will be, of course, the HR Congress in Brussels taking place 28th, 29th of November at the Egg. So yes, please, if you're interested in the HR Congress, come along. It'll be a fantastic time. We look forward to having everyone there. Obviously, the discount code is Tamra_webinar, 20% discount. Finally, I just want to say that if you have any further questions relating to us, the webinar series, please email the managing director of the company, Mihai_nudge at stanfordglobal.com, and he will be happy to answer any questions that you have.